So on February 17th of 1970, a man named Jeffrey McDonald was charged with the murder of his wife, his two children, well, his pregnant wife and his two children, Kristen and Kimberly, aged 5 and 2 years. Originally, he was not charged with the murder because he claimed to have been also a victim. He injured himself and was found along with them and taken to the hospital and treated, and gave a bizarre story that a woman in a floppy hat and two men had come into his house and assaulted him and his wife and children. And she had quoted "kill the pigs" and written "pigs" on the headboard of their children before promptly murdering them with a pickaxe, actually an ice pick. And all of them were brutally assaulted multiple times with this ice pick. And it's an odd circumstance because Jeffrey McDonald was a physician and he was very well known. He was, in high school, he was known to be the man who was most likely to succeed, the man who was most popular. And so it's really unusual that he would turn down that path, though there's never really any signs to be able to tell. So through various investigation, the forensic analysts who were working on this case were able to determine that it was Jeffrey McDonald by finding DNA that belonged to him on the clothing. His story was a bit bizarre in the first place, so it was a little bit helpful as to why he probably was the one to have committed the homicides. However, it was through forensics that we were able to come to this conclusion ultimately. And so this is welcoming you to the world of forensics. Now specifically, I am Allyson C, if you don't know me, and my quote is a question that sometimes drives me hazy: am I or the others crazy? Which is by Albert Einstein. And it's my favorite because it sort of portrays the fact that one does not truly know what belongs in the mind of others. When we look at someone else, we don't know what they're thinking, we don't know what they're feeling. Anyone could be anyone, and we just sort of judge people based on our morals or our general assumption of goodness, and perhaps that's not always the correct answer. I'm 17 years old. I'm a senior at Frisco High School. I have a moving family. My father is a surgeon, and so we move constantly to one place or another. We haven't really settled down in one place for more than about 4 or 5 years. I have 2 sisters and 1 brother. One of my sisters, Madison Cabanis, actually goes here to Frisco High School. She is a freshman this year. She plays on a lot of the sports teams. And I'm interested in creative writing. I really enjoy authors such as Edgar Allan Poe. I think he really opens up some interesting perspectives. I also enjoy painting, drawing, space exploration. I especially enjoy space exploration. I don't know why, but space has always been another passion of mine. And I also enjoy microbiology, which fits along with my topic almost perfectly. So specifically, I want to focus on forensic pathology, which is what I am ultimately studying this year. Forensic pathologists are generally doctors, have their MD or DO. They do autopsies, they write certificates of death, they participate in court and speak their testimonies of the bodies, and they're also medical examiners. However, they're not to be confused with forensic anthropologists, which focus specifically on bones, or morticians, which are slightly different. They work with embalming the body. Forensic anthropology, however, is a subdivision I'm working on of forensic pathology. My ultimate goal is forensic pathology. However, I'm studying forensic anthropology in forensic pathology. So I would be doing skeleton cases as well as regular forensic pathology cases. So complete decomposition cases, this is when the skeleton is completely and utterly revealed from the flesh. So it's the bones. You also write the certificate of death for the skeletons if you can determine if there's been any damage done to any of the organs, the skeleton bones, or if there's any missing Bones, sometimes they get scattered. You also have to determine the identification based on the bones, skull, different things. And sometimes it's just historical. You can go through, such as if you've ever seen the show Bones. She works at the Smithsonian, and a lot of her work is with murder cases, but at the same time she works sometimes in the background doing just old skeletons that have been found from the Civil War, and she identifies soldiers, which is also a thing that forensic anthropologists do. So my interview experiences were amazing. I don't want to get into a whole lot of detail because I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time on my forensic, on my final product. I have a lot of information about that. So I first interviewed Miss Jennifer Walls, and she was particularly helpful to me. She was a funeral director, and she taught me a lot about embalming and just being a mortician, which I thought was really interesting. There were a lot of tools that were used that I never would have imagined, and it's really creative, and there's a lot that goes into it as opposed to what I thought in the beginning when I walked in. And then I interviewed Dr. Reed Quinton. He's a medical examiner at the Stemmons Forensic Institute of Science, and he gave me a basic outline of what a forensic pathologist does and what's to be expected of a forensic pathologist, which I thought was fantastic because I didn't really have, I had a pretty good idea, but I wanted to just kind of run it with an actual forensic pathologist who did this every day. He introduced me to Dr. Tracy Dyer and Dr. Jill Urban, who I got 2 interviews in with on the same day. Dr. Tracy Dyer is also a medical examiner. She has a background in law, which she said is particularly useful because she's able to, when she goes into court, to understand what is going on during the court sessions and to present the evidence in a way that may be more helpful. Dr. Jill Urban, who is my current mentor, is also a medical examiner, but she also is a forensic anthropologist, and so she works a lot with bones as well as regular bodies, which is something I'm interested in, so I fit best with her, and I really clicked with her the moment we met. And then I met with Dr. Stephen Hastings, who is a pathology fellow. He told me that some of the most important things you can focus on are the MCAT in college when you want to get into medical school, because they look for people who are well-rounded and people who are serious about doing what they want to do, but at the same time are willing to open up and do more things such as community work. So Dr. Jill Urban, my mentor, she graduated from Kansas State University with a Bachelor of Anthropology. She's a forensic pathologist and also a forensic anthropologist, as I explained before. She does a lot of the skeletonized cases that they get in at the morgue, which is really interesting for her. She says she really enjoys it. She also visited the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, which is a body farm, which those of you who don't know what that is, that's where they set several decomposing bodies out in different circumstances to see how temperature will change the deterioration rate of a dead individual, and etc. She's married with 2 children. She enjoys running, surfing the internet, and making jewelry. So my research experiences, I'm also not going to go into a whole lot of these. Outlook assessment, I looked at forensic pathology to figure out what was happening there generally, and it's 11 to 18 years in medical school, 10 to 12 hours, probably a night. Suicide versus homicide, so I learned that there are very, very interesting differences between suicide and homicide. When you look at a suicide case versus a homicide case, there are some very determining factors. I also looked at photography pitfalls, which is basically when you take pictures of the skeleton, which I've had to do this year for my final product. There are certain things that you need to look out for when you take a picture, such as people's feet getting in the way of the pictures if they're walking by, or camera glare, etc. And then I looked at atherosclerotic CD, which is basically it's an unidentified circumstance that happens sometimes that'll claim an individual for death without warning, or sometimes it does give warning, but it's very, very frank warning, which is really interesting because there's not really been anyone who's been able to find out a whole lot about it, just other than the fact that it is random and it's sometimes increased by things such as drugs, but it's also can occur within people that are not drug addicts or such. And then data gathering methods in forensic anthropology. There are several different ways that you need to gather information on an skeletonized individual, and at times this can prove difficult if you don't have the right data gathering methods. You have to follow the very specific procedures in order to get the information that you need. And then internal examination key points. For when you examine the person's internal organs, there are some things that you need to make sure that you look for or notice. And then I did the UNT trip, and I took several classes on things that I thought would be helpful or interesting, such as microbiology. And I did a lot of other research experiences too, but if I were to explain them all, it would probably take like an hour. So I'm just going to go ahead and move on to my next thing, which is my original product. I did a booklet of the most unnatural deaths, which was really interesting to me to be able to study the cold cases that they had out and all of the different solutions that I can offer, because some of the cold cases were sort of uncovered. They weren't figured out. Nobody could really discover who had finished it, and so in my mind I like to be able to go over these cold cases and try to think of possible solutions or think of ways that they might have been able to do things differently. A lot of the cases I looked at were back in the time when our forensic science was not as advanced as it is now, and so I like to be able to analyze the possibilities for what might have occurred and what we might have been able to do differently now that we have the technology that we do today. I also had a lot of fun looking at serial killers, which has always been something that I found of interest. I saw lots of serial killers that I had never heard of before, and I researched them a lot, so it's always strange when I hear of a serial killer that I have never heard of. I like to be able to differentiate between categories, homicide, suicide, just to organize it a little bit. It gave it more of a professional feel, since you could be able to look through all of the different categories and find specifically what you were looking for. It was a great learning experience. So my final product is writing a death certificate. And this is very similar to the death certificates that my actual mentor writes. She goes over, she has to look at an individual and find all of the different parts that are missing and all of the different parts that are ajar in an individual when they've been deceased. And so that's a picture of my case that I have currently going on. And there are several parts of the skeleton that she took out and that are missing. And that's to kind of emulate a real case in which you won't have all of the parts of a skeletonized individual. And you have to take an inventory of all of the skeleton bones that you have. So generally what I had there was I had a skull, I had a mandible, I had about, not even half of the rib cage. I had three or four cervical vertebrae, about 3 thoracic, 3 lumbar. I had a complete pelvis. I had, surprisingly, a tibia and a femur. I had both radius and ulna on both hands and both humerus, which was amazing, and one clavicle, which was the left clavicle. And then I had a patella, and I had some strange foot bones. So I had to try to figure out the race of the individual from the skull, the gender from the pelvis and the skull, the stature measurement from the long bones, which femur is best for that, the age from the pelvic symphysis and the ribs, and I'll show you where that is in a second. There's also an animal presence. So sometimes when forensic anthropologists or even just police will arrive at the scene sometimes and they'll look at the skeleton, they'll try to gather all of the skeleton together and put it into a box for you. However, sometimes they pick up animal parts thinking that they're human. So that occurs often. So the race, this is also another picture of my case. In order to determine the race, I was looking at the skull, which is, there's the nasal foramen, which is basically the big hole, which is the nose hole, if you will. And judging from the shape of the nasal foramen, which is about twice as tall as it is width-wise, that's more consistent with a Caucasian individual. The nasal prognathism, which is where the nose comes out and stops and matches with the teeth, is linear, which also is more consistent with the Caucasian. The orbits are angular and rounded, which is consistent with Caucasian. There's a suture presence, if you can see, that's about right here between the two eye orbits, which is only found in Caucasian individuals. And the nasal root is contours or steepled, which it goes down like this as opposed to being more straight or being wider. So from all this information, I was able to determine that the skull was more consistent with Caucasian features. That's to show the nasal prognathism, which is where the edge of the nose lines up with the tooth. Oh. Okay, so you see how it's linear. For the gender usually goes along with the skull texture, which is very smooth in females and very rugged and rough in males because of the muscle detachment that is required for the males. The eye orbits are usually delicate and sharp. They have more delicate brow lines than the males, which are more defined. They have an occipital protrusion in the back for males, where a very large muscle attaches in the neck. And there's an anterior acetabulum, which is on the pelvis, which I'll show you in a second, and a pelvic inlet. So this is the pelvis, and just to show you that if you were to put these two together, which I did to get a general idea, the pelvis was very wide, and that's generally consistent with females because of childbirth. And there's also the anterior acetabulum, which is, when you put these together, it's very heart-shaped. For the stature, also I discovered that it was a female. So the stature, and that's discovered by the long bones. There's lots of different bones you can use to discover the stature of an individual. However, the most reliable is the femur, and so the femur is often used to discover the stature of an individual. Using the trotter method, there's lots of different methods that can be used. However, the trotter is the one that my mentor enjoys the most, and so I thought I would use that. I took the measurements of the radius, the humerus, the femur, pretty much anything I got the opportunity to take the measurement of, and I got to compare the different measurements with one another, and I discovered that the individual was approximately 5'2", 5'3", and that moves on to age. And so with age, there's the Suchi-Brooks method, which is used most of the time by forensic anthropologists. You look at the pubic symphysis, which is what I'm showing here, which is on the pelvis, which is more towards the front. It's where a lot of, cartilage, it's where cartilage attaches. And so a lot of the time, over a period of extended time, an individual will experience lots of corrosion to this particular place as time goes on. So the older they are, the more desurfaced it gets and smoother. And you can tell by looking at several pictures. They'll have stages, and you can match up the stage with the range. You can also tell from the rib determination. There's a sternal end that connects to your sternum here, and if you take the measurements of the rib there and you look at how far along, you can also find a stage from that and match it up with the age. I determined from the Suchi-Brooks pubic symphysis and also the rib determination that there was, this individual is generally from about 27 years of age to maybe around 40, 50, and they usually give a larger range because they don't want to narrow it down to something big. Some of the skeletons can be a little strange. They won't quite match up with what most skeletons are because everyone's different. And so if you narrow it down to something so small, usually it's really difficult for an individual to be able to determine. They might be on a missing report as 30 years of age, and you've narrowed down the age to 28 through 29. And then they say, oh, well, no, it can't be them because this person is 30, and you said that it's 28 through 29. So you try to make the range a little bit larger so that people, if they have a strange skeleton and they're actually older than their skeleton looks, then you can go ahead and safely say that they're in this range. So that's a picture of the sternal attachment for the rib, and it's a very blurry picture. We tried, trust me. The camera was not cooperating that day. However, you can see it pretty well. It's difficult to tell the depth in this picture. However, with age, generally this rib will become more deep as time goes on, and the rim around it will become thinner, and sometimes we'll get protrusions which kind of come out like jagged angles, which you don't see a whole lot of that there, indicating that the individual is a little bit younger. So the official documentation, I do not have that completed as of yet. You will get to see that very soon, based on actual reports. So I've looked through tons and tons of my mentor's reports, and I've seen the way she does it, and I've read them and seen the way that she interprets the information. They're used to determine the cause of death and identify the individual, and so I'm going to do my best to determine the consistencies of the individual, the skeleton, the best I can. I don't get to determine the cause of death because the skeleton that we're working on is a practice skeleton, so there's no damage done to any of the bones or anything like that. But I think it'll be just as fun to try to identify the individual's race, gender, stature, etc. There's also historical use for official documentation, such as Civil War and so on. That's the box that my skeleton was received in. Basically, I received a box with 4 bags inside of the smaller bones, including a beaver mandible, which the police, aka my mentor, thought to be a human fetus, which was incorrect. And it was kind of fun to be able to go through and see the beaver mandible and say, no, this isn't human, and then to try to place an actual animal to the skull, the mandible. So this is another picture of my skeleton, but the case closed. For the future, I'm going to be attending Collin County College in order to knock out core classes, and then I'll be transferring to basically any medical school. I'm not particularly picky. Forensic anthropology and forensic pathology, I plan to do what my mentor is doing and take on forensic pathologist cases, which is just regular decomposing bodies, as well as completely decomposed bodies and skeletonized. I'm going to continue my study of basically anything I can pertaining to forensic pathology and anthropology. I hope to be able to finish as quickly as I can because I want to head into forensic pathology with as much information as I can, but also I want to have lots of time to be able to devote to this. I'm really looking forward to being able to study more, and I could not have done any of it without my mentor. She really had all of the ideas and helped me and guided me along and taught me everything I needed to know, which was really great. And I really enjoyed this product because it was just such a learning experience, and it was really, really fun. So thank you.